Meanwhile, the Hamas terror attack marking the single deadliest day with mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. But according to Harvard elites, Israel is to blame. In a joint statement, more than 30 groups at Harvard stating, quote, "We hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. Today's events did not happen in a vacuum. The apartheid regime is the only one to blame. Israeli violence has structured every aspect of Palestinian existence for 75 years. Palestinians have been forced to live in a state of death, both slow and sudden."
Moments ago, Harvard itself finally addressing the attacks in a statement saying, in part, "We want to emphasize our commitment to fostering an environment of dialogue and empathy in a time of unimaginable loss and sorrow." Independent presidential candidate and Harvard alum Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is here to react. Good morning to you.
Morning, Ashley.
Good morning. What is your reaction to that?
To the Harvard?
Yes, sir.
I think it's a perverse reading of history. And, anybody who's kind of interested in, and it's perverse to say the least, because there's 2,400 people wounded. There's 900 Israelis dead. Hamas came across and murdered people at a music festival. All of us saw the videos on social media of children in cages in Gaza, of Jewish bodies, of a teenage girl being abused in front of a crowd and people cheering, of bodies being paraded around in trucks. So to say that Israel is at fault for that is just perverse. And then if you look at the history of the region, anybody who believes that narrative, which is a propaganda narrative, should go look at Prince Bandar bin Sultan's speech in 2020. He was a great champion. He was the head of the Saudi intelligence. He was at all the peace negotiations. He's a huge champion, lifelong champion of the Palestinian people. And what he said again and again, the Palestinians have been betrayed by their leadership. Yasser Arafat died a billionaire. Mahmoud Abbas, the current leader of the Palestinian Authority, is a billionaire. His sons are 100 millionaires. They keep their people in poverty. Again and again, the Israelis have offered peace on extremely generous terms. The Ehud Barak in 2000 offered again and again, 1937, 1947, 2000. The Israelis have wanted to trade peace for land. And they, again and again, the Palestinian leadership has betrayed its own people by refusing to even negotiate about that, or refusing to a counteroffer. So there's a long history. Anybody can read it. People, again, who are skeptical of that, who are buying this narrative, should go to Prince Bandar's speech, and he recounts it. He was at the front line of everyone, and every time he said it was the Palestinian leadership, out of greed, out of cowardice, who betrayed their own people by refusing to negotiate for peace.
Riyadh has not given up on their version of the Abraham Accords, expanding it despite this conflict and their relatively unsympathetic statements towards the Israelis initially on Saturday. By the way, we're splitting the screen with you. We're just getting rocket fire into Israel. That was live. Now you're seeing some of the rubble inside Gaza. What's interesting is Gallup did a poll, and they asked Democrats how you feel about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the majority of young people, 25 to 45, are more sympathetic toward the Palestinian cause. And that's been happening in your now former party. Where does that come from?
I think it's not only at the lower levels of the party, too, but I think, President Biden, by giving $6 billion to Iran without any conditions, without any indication or pledges of peace, has probably aggravated the situation now.
Well, we got hostages back in exchange.
Yeah, we got hostages back in exchange, and 3 weeks later, there's now new hostages.
A massive Middle East.
Right, and I mean, that's been our policy for a long time, is to not pay for hostages, and because it just encourages more kidnapping and more hostage taking, and that's what we're seeing here.
Well, you've had a busy week. On Monday of this week, you announced in Philadelphia that you're going to run for president as an independent. How big, you're from one of the most famous Democratic families of all time. How big a step was it to say, you know what, today, sorry family, I'm going to have to take a step away?
It was very painful for me. I mean, I was raised in the Democratic Party. My father, my uncles were the leaders of the party. Our relationship with the Democratic Party goes back generations. My great grandfather, Honey Fitz, was the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. My other great grandfather, Patrick Kennedy, was a ward boss for the Democratic Party in Boston. So leaving the party of my, my family is very, very difficult for me. But it was a choice that I didn't feel I had a choice about. And I think it's the right thing right now because we're seeing that, it's the same corporate donors that control both of the parties. And the parties are in paralysis. They cannot, within that party system, they're locked in this war with each other, and the polarization, the name calling. They're polarizing the American public, and we need a strategy for unity. We need a strategy for bringing people together. And what I've found traveling the country is that there's much more, even among the most extreme Democrats and Republicans. There's still more that we have in common than the issues that are being used to drive us apart. Everybody wants a clean environment. Everybody wants to take care of our veterans. Everybody wants our kids to have a good education. And everybody wants to make sure the regulatory agencies are serving the public interest instead of working for the corporations that they're supposed to regulate. And I think we need somebody who's going to find those areas of agreement, the values we agree on, rather than focus on these little issues that have us at each other's throats.
As a lifelong Democrat, are you worried that you will be taking 10, maybe 20% of Biden's votes?
I hope to take votes from both President Biden and President Trump.
An equal opportunity.
Look at the stats that shows you you have 48% approval with Republicans, and you have about 14% approval with Democrats. So Donald Trump's going to look at you as a threat if he does in fact get the nomination. Are you ready for him to come after you?
Yeah, I feel like I have my own moral center, and I'm not going to engage in the bitterness. I hope Donald Trump will dispute me on the issues, and that we can all talk about the issues that affect America and what's happening to the middle class, the systematic destruction of the middle class.
You agree on a lot.
Yeah, there are areas of agreements, and there's areas that I have agreement with President Biden. So I think people are tired of the vitriol, and I'm not going to engage in that.
Can I just bring it to this? Kerry Kennedy, Rory Kennedy, Joe Kennedy on Monday denounced you in a statement saying Bobby might share the name of our father, but he does not share the same values, vision, or judgment. That's got to hurt.
Well, you know what? I love my family. Every family has disputes. I've got a lot of family members who are supporting me. There's a lot of members of my family who are working for the Biden administration, and they have their own opinions about issues. Mm-hmm. I believe, let me say this, and all of the issues that my father believed in and my uncle believed in, if you went down and checked the box, that I would check every box. So I believe that I'm very much aligned with those things. I'm aligned with the Democratic Party that stood for the working class, that was skeptical of the military-industrial complex, that was skeptical about corporate control of the government, that was against censorship, violently against, fiercely, let's say, against censorship. And that was against using fear as a governing tool. Franklin Roosevelt said to us, the only thing to fear is fear itself. I don't know anybody in the Democratic Party who's saying, I'm voting for President Biden because I think he can govern the country well. They are all say, I'm voting for President Biden because I don't want Trump to be president, because he's dangerous. And that is, again, it's the impulse to govern by fear rather than, inspiring.
Right.
Let me just say one quick thing. There's a poll that recently came out that showed that in 2013, 85% of American kids between 18 and 35 said they were proud of the United States of America. The same poll taken 3 weeks ago said that only 17% are. So
sad.
we are, this politics of vitriol is just, we have completely betrayed that generation of American kids. We need to give them something to hope for.
Right.
Not telling them vote for Biden because, we're scared. Or rather vote for somebody whose vision that you believe in that gives you hope for our country.
And of course, you would like their vote. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you very much for joining us on this Breaking News Day.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Good to have you.
Frank.
All right.
And that's why I'm here today. I'm here to declare myself an independent candidate.
That was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announcing his defection from the Democratic Party to run for president as an independent. In his fiery speech, RFK Jr. declared independence for America from corporations, from Wall Street, and from Big Pharma, which he maintains is stoking division in this country. His quest to bring an end to the two-party system was not welcomed by his immediate family. His sister, Kerry Kennedy, released a statement on their behalf, rebuking his announcement and writing, quote, Bobby might share the name as same name as our father, but he does not share the same values, vision, or judgment. Today's announcement, deeply saddening for us. We denounce his candidacy and believe it to be perilous for our country.
The Republican National Committee also denounced RFK Jr.'s switch. Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel released a statement writing, quote, make no mistake, a Democrat in independence clothing is still a Democrat. RFK Jr. cannot hide from his record. He is your typical elitist liberal, and voters won't be fooled. As a Democratic candidate, polls showed that RFK Jr. tracked well with voters, pulling in 14%, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll released last week, which may not seem consequential, but it's enough to disrupt GOP frontrunner Trump's support, as well as President Joe Biden's, according to an analysis from CNN. This is what's so interesting. So there was some reporting at the end of last week that the Trump campaign had some internal conversation about how to best respond to RFK Jr. after some of this polling suggested that he could pull more potentially from Donald Trump than Joe Biden. There was a statement by one of Trump's campaign spokesperson, Stephen Chung, who said in no uncertain terms that RFK Jr. is not a conservative. He says voters should not be deceived by anyone who pretends to have conservative values. The fact is that RFK has a disturbing background steeped in radical liberal positions, whether he's a China sympathizer, denigrating gun owners, promoting business-killing green policies, or supporting on-demand abortion. An RFK candidacy is nothing more than a vanity project, for a liberal candidate to cash in on his family's name. We haven't seen this kind of energy against RFK Jr. from Republicans up until this point.
Well, now they perceive him as a threat.
Exactly.
They didn't perceive him as a threat before. And look, the truth is that he has, at this point, a mix of political opinions that do not, frankly, fit neatly into any category. He has some opinions that are welcome on the populist left. He has some opinions that are more conservative in nature. He has a lot of his COVID-related opinions, and some, but not all, of his foreign policy opinions fit somewhat within a libertarian framework, which is why he was drawing a lot of interest from my own party. He attended a lot of libertarian gatherings in the last few months. He was clearly meeting with libertarian-aligned people. He had a lot of engagement on social media with the LP account. That said, what he announced about Israel the other day, support for additional military funding, really is at odds with a kind of fundamental view of the Libertarian Party that we should just not. Without taking a side in the conflict, that's not it. It's just the U.S. should not be in the business. The U.S. taxpayer should not be in the business of paying for another country's defense. So they were pushing back on him there. So anyway, he's running as an independent. Look, it is possible that he hurts Trump more than Biden. It's possible he hurts Biden slightly more because of the Kennedy family name and being associated with Democrats. It's possible that he draws some voters from both sides and it's kind of a wash. And also he draws some voters who would have voted Libertarian, Green, or just would not have voted at all, frankly. So everybody needs to chill out. I also don't, frankly, care if he costs a major party voters because they're not speaking to the issues he's talking about in terms of COVID authoritarianism and some other things. So I don't really think there's a reason to panic. But if there was a reason to panic, I frankly wouldn't care if it hurt the major parties either way.
That's so interesting. I mean, much like wokeness seems to have taken a back seat as a kind of driver of the conversation on the right, it does seem also like some of the COVID policy stuff seems not to be as galvanizing.
Well, I mean, they are
as it
going
once
away,
was.
Thankfully.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It was a bell that could only be rung so many times. I mean,
yeah.
A caveat that it's not actually gone away. You can feel how you feel about how serious it is, and people feeling like they need to protect themselves in different ways. But we don't have
Well, I
to
mean, the
get into
policies have mostly gone by the
mandated,
wayside,
yes,
which
the
everyone was,
objectionable.
I guess. Mostly, not
cohort
entirely, but mostly.
have gone away. So there's nothing really to complain about anymore. And it's also worth noting that when we talked yesterday about the Libertarian Party Twitter account, at least, offering basically rejecting RFK Jr. on the internet a couple of days ago, it wasn't just because RFK Jr. kind of expressed support for Israel. Many people, including many leftists who have been strong advocates for Palestinian rights, expressed support of Israel and the civilian casualties that, of course, were not responsible and were innocents and were victims of a war crime. But they also say things about wanting to get to the root causes and ending the occupation. That's not only not something that RFK Jr. has said, which angers the left, it makes him unsupportable by many leftists, but also said we must provide Israel with whatever it needs to defend itself. Again, some of this kind of blank check language that he and others found so objectionable when it came to Ukraine. And I do wonder if at this point, not saying anything about ending the occupation, having said so many things that are frankly very, very aggressive with respect to the Israel-Palestine issue, the funding issue being inconsistent with respect to the Ukraine stuff. Someone who labeled themselves as a Kennedy Democrat up until 3 days ago or whatever it was on their website, and who very much was hoping to trade on this popularity of a liberal identity, which is now very toxic to both sides of the camp, the anti-establishment camp that he was appealing to, whether or not this whole phenomenon is going to fizzle away pretty quickly, especially if it is true that he is seen as a threat to Republicans and is no longer given the boost by people like Elon Musk or other big accounts, Joe Rogan, et cetera.
I saw our former co-host Kim Iverson, who has her own channel, independent channel, and she's been, I think, quite positively disposed to him. She's interviewed him on her show. I saw her tweeting that this really would cost him her support for what he said there. Look, and I don't want to be too critical of him. I'm glad that he has brought attention to a lot of issues where I am more in line with him. Again, in terms of the COVID stuff, in terms of Ukraine, I'm glad he has given a voice to and hopefully a voice not technically actually in the Republican contingent, but expressing the frustrations of there are people who self-identified or used to self-identify at least as Democrats who didn't quite like the response on all fronts either. So I think and also, Joe Biden deserved a challenger. All our political figures deserve
Absolutely.
a challenger. So I think his involvement was positive and could continue to be positive, but I don't agree with him on everything. And I didn't agree with him on everything even before this. A lot of his regulatory policies on energy and drugs are probably more in line with your views and not in line with mine. And it was always going to be interesting to see, well, how much is he changing his mind on those enough to be acceptable to a libertarian? And that was, always going to be a difficult marriage.
Well, it is interesting. I think the most important, perhaps, and most relevant prong of his analysis and what he's been running on is the anti-corruption piece, which hasn't got as much airing by the media, because I do think that some of the more right-leaning outlets that boosted his campaign weren't as interested in some of that stuff. corporate capture of the regulatory industry wasn't as sexy as some of the COVID policies and stuff like that. But given what's going on in the House with this weird alliance emerging between Matt Gaetz and Ro Khanna over some of these big ticket anti-corruption items, I would love to hear him start to talk about real politics and give us a sense of who he would be as a president. What side of this would he be on as we're looking at Matt Gaetz taking these stands on the House floor, calling out corruption and getting booed by his own caucus? Where does Kennedy fit in all of that? And I think it would also help the voter perhaps to see him less as a kind of popular figure, a cartoon, an icon, whatever it is, like almost like a caricature of a person, and more as a politician in a role that he is actually advocating for right now as president. So we'll see if we see a pivot at all towards some real politics now that he has made this shift in his campaign. To being independent.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see also as this continues what impact he does have on the race. If his poll numbers go up or down, if they go up enough that he could qualify. I think it would be to the benefit of the American people if there was actually a debate with the nominees, assuming they're Donald Trump and Joe Biden or whoever they are, but probably those two, and Kennedy. I think that would be enormously beneficial for the democratic process. So, that's one reason to kind of to keep an eye out for him, I think.
I do think there might be some interesting implications for his ability to get onto a debate stage now that he's an independent and not just competing with the Democratic Party as well. So we'll keep you updated on that. Stick around. More Rising right after this.
Thanks so much for joining us, Mark Goodwin from Bitcoin Magazine. Very thankful for your time here. As we're doing, Bitcoin's kind of entered the political arena, the spectrum, in no part thanks to you for sure, or in big part thanks to you. Curious, if your father was around today, would he recognize the current state of the DNC? And in following up with that, what is a Kennedy Democrat to you?
Well, I would say Kennedy Democrats are, the traditional Democratic Party, which was the party of the working class, the working poor. It was a party that was very, very strong traditionally on the environment. Its tradition has been, again, anti-war, and skeptical of the military-industrial complex, and also skeptical of Wall Street and I would say, a posture of preventing Wall Street from dictating policies that end up serving the mercantile interests of the corporate aristocracy and the corporate kleptocracy, and stripping the middle class, working people, union members of their wealth and their power.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't sound like the DNC today.
No.
On that spectrum, how do you plan to take on the super monopolies that control our food, media, currency, and health?
Well, in each sector, you kind of have to do something different. I mean, it's true that there's been this extraordinary consolidation where these three giant finance houses, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, control 88% of the S&P 500, and they control virtually all of the military contractors. They control most of the U.S.-based agricultural sector, the big packing companies and seed companies, etc. And in each sector, you have to do something, and then the pharmaceutical industry.
Sure.
So each sector, you have to do different things. And in each sector, those industries also have 20 or 30 years of developing methodologies for capturing and controlling the regulatory agencies that are supposed to protect the public from bad behavior by those companies. But instead, those regulators have become sock puppets for the industries they're supposed to regulate. And in each case, you have to unravel corporate capture. I think that I'm probably the best person at this point in this country that's suited to do that, because so much of my career has been litigating against those agencies and the industries that have corrupted them. And when you bring litigation, you really almost get a PhD in corporate capture. You really understand the dynamics of it and understand, therefore, the methods for unraveling it. And I'll give you an example. When we brought the Monsanto case, we uncovered discovery documents that showed that the head of the pesticide division at EPA, a man named Jess Rowland, was secretly working for Monsanto,
Right.
and that his orders were being given to him by Monsanto executives who were instructing him to kill studies that they thought might link Roundup, the active ingredient in their flagship pesticide, glyphosate, the active ingredient in their flagship pesticide Roundup, from links to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and other cancers. And it was clear that although he was being paid by the American taxpayer, he was actually working for Monsanto. And this is true, unfortunately, throughout the agencies. This is more the rule than the exception.
Oh, yeah.
And, because I've been so deeply involved in this kind of litigation, I actually know the names of people that I need to move as soon as I get into office. Most politicians are very, very intimidated by these agencies, because the agencies do have the capacity at many levels to commit civil disobediences to embarrass the president if they feel that they're coming under pressure. And, I understand that dynamic, and I understand what needs to be done to unravel this corrupt merger of state and corporate power.
Yeah, that carousel of C-suite executives to regulation, it's just absurd. Yeah. As when you do take office, what actions would you take to ensure free speech, free press, and an open internet acting as like a public square for discourse, especially for dissident voices against these kind of propaganda machines?
Well, number one, my first day in office, I'll issue an executive order against any federal agency or any federal regulator encouraging or promoting censorship at any social media site. So, in addition to that, I'll promote legislation to change the RICO Act, the Racketeering Act, which my father originally wrote.
Yeah.
To include as a predicate offense the government dictated censorship of free speech. Also summons the heads of all of the major social media sites, including YouTube and Google, which continue to censor political speech in this country. And I'll tell them that that they need to come up with a plan about how they're going to avoid censoring political speech, and the sanction, of course, ultimately is to transform them into public utilities and recognize that they now have become the public square.
Right.
And then also I'll put in legislation to amend the Communications Act, which includes Section 230, and I will, in that act, I will make the censorship of political speech illegal.
Amazing, incredible answer. If democracy innately necessitates informed consent, can the U.S. government fairly call for the violent defense of democracy as a pillar of foreign policy while doing what you're saying, while working with big tech to censor stories within its own country?
Criticism of, for example, the war in Ukraine.
A perfect example.
Yeah, well, that should be illegal. I mean, individual media sites, of course, should be able to criticize the war, and they can either criticize it or they can choose not to, not to allow criticism on their pages.
Right.
And that's their option. But if they're doing it at the direction of the government, then the First Amendment is implicated and it becomes illegal.
Right.
And that's the way that I would treat it.
Right. And how can they really fairly say that they're defending democracy worldwide? That necessitates informed consent while doing that, like violently doing this, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the idea that America promotes democracy worldwide is generally regarded as canard around the world. I mean,
Right.
the CIA has participated, I think, in 87 coups between 1947 and 1997. So that includes a third of the nations on Earth.
Right.
And most of them were democracies. And then USAID, which is a CIA front,
Sure.
spends $10 billion a year essentially in efforts to overthrow democracies in various countries. So to do regime change operation.
Sure.
Well, when you do a regime change operation, you're countervailing democracy in that country because usually the regime has been put in place through some kind of consensus by the people who live in that country.
And consensus manufactured by projects like Operation Mockingbird.
Yeah. I mean, the CIA today is the biggest funder of journalism in the world.
Right.
It's not supposed to fund journalism in the U.S., but it does.
It does, yeah.
But it also, if you look around the world, it owns newspapers, it runs newspapers, it pays editors those newspapers, it pays leading journalists in most of the developing world.
Yeah.
And in Europe.
Yeah. Speaking of journalists and prosecution from the United States on journalists, do you intend to pardon Julian Assange when you take office?
Yeah, I will pardon Julian Assange on day one, and probably Edward Snowden as well.
Beautiful.
And then I will look at other cases, for a pardon. I'm going to look at Russ Ulrich's case.
Beautiful.
To see if he was justly convicted or if he was, and whether his conviction and his sentence reflects the seriousness of his crime or whether he was being made an example of in order to discourage, Bitcoin or the industry.
Sure.
And if I find out that that is the case, then I will pardon him as well.
Beautiful. Speaking of that, I mean, how is what Ross did any different than what like AT&T executives, allowing drug dealers and human traffickers to use their systems, or JP Morgan allowing human traffickers to be banked with? How is what Ross did any different than that?
Well, there are many ironies that are that accompany Ross's convictions.
Right.
I think that's a really good point, is that the things that he was accused of are things that are just part of the business structure and the business plan of these leading blue chip corporations. But he didn't have that power or the lobbying clout. And I think, and if I find that his sentence was unjust, I will reverse it.
Beautiful. Do you think if people knew that, they had to raise taxes and obviously have this inflationary, price action to expense the trillions of dollars needed for these wars or for the COVID response, do you think there would be public support at all if people really understood the cost?
I don't think any of the wars that we fought, at least since the Korean War, and maybe including the Korean War, would have been approved by taxpayers in advance.
Mm-hmm.
The fiat currency was created in order to enable nations to go to war without levying the taxes outright on populations.
Right.
The population still pays for it, but it pays through a stealth tax called inflation.
Right.
But fiat currency was invented long before the Fed.
Right.
And it was invented at the outset from the beginning in order to fund the cost of war.
Right. Yeah, true. Speaking of fiat currencies and all this, and a state change, hopefully, to this, what initially sparked your interest in Bitcoin, and why are you interested in the Bitcoin voting block?
Well, my interest in Bitcoin began when I saw the truckers strike.
Beautiful.
And what happened in Ottawa, where you had peaceful demonstration of people who were exercising their right to protest and petition public officials for very, very good reasons. And they were silenced and punished by the government in an extraordinary way. The government used surveillance techniques to determine their identities, to determine their license plates of their cars, and then close their bank accounts and deprive them of their access to their own money without any charges being filed, certainly without any conviction, but simply to silence them. And if the government has the capacity to shut down your bank account to starve you, these were people who could not pay their mortgages.
Right.
I talked to one trucker who couldn't pay his alimony, and he was getting in, criminal trouble with his courts. People couldn't pay for their children's clothing and medicine and food. And of course, they couldn't pay for gasoline to move their vehicles. So their credit cards no longer worked.
Right.
And if the government has the capacity to do that, the government has the capacity to enslave us. So if they can starve their critics,
Right.
They can accomplish any atrocity.
Yeah. Scary.
And at that point, I began to understand that that freedom of transaction is as important as freedom of speech, and that Bitcoin is this. I can see also the trajectory toward central bank digital currencies.
Sure.
And the power that will give nations, this ultimate power over whether we live or die ultimately.
Right.
And I understood that we need a currency that is a freedom currency, a
Right.
currency that is independent and that can't be controlled by the government.
Yeah, agreed. You recently floated, this very novel idea of alongside other hard assets, backing the U.S. dollar and some debt with using Bitcoin. Based on that kind of thread you just said, are you concerned at all about government influence or restrictions with regards to Bitcoin or Bitcoin mining?
Well, I'm very concerned about all the government attacks on Bitcoin.
Right.
But what I would like to do is to at least provide some issuance of treasury bills that is backed by hard currency. And that could be a bucket that includes Bitcoin, that includes platinum, gold, silver,
Sure.
and other hard assets. And that that would not be completely covered, but maybe beginning with 1%.
Right.
And the reason for that, it's really a drop in the bucket of the total deals. But it would, we can see if there's a market out there, and that it would impose a kind of discipline on this just out of control printing of money, because the consumers would have access to an asset that at least had some basis in hard currency and was therefore at least some immunity from runaway inflation.
Right.
And if there's a preference for that, then we could increase the amount every year, 1 to 2% to 3% and so on, and get back to at least some level of some option for base currencies.
Speaking of, how do you see the future of the U.S. dollar kind of developing as we're kind of seeing, you mentioned CBDCs, but we're seeing stable coins and these other kind of dollar derivatives now kind of coming out. We're seeing a rapid globalization of the dollar at a very high velocity. Obviously, I think you can see this Bitcoin future, but how do you see the dollar kind of developing as?
Well, I think the dollar, the future of the dollar is uncertain. I mean, one of the big factors is the sort of exponential growth of BRICS.
Right.
BRICS, which began with with Brazil and Russia and India and China is now, and South Africa is now adding another 6 countries, and they will, and they're an alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency. They don't have their own currency, but they allow transactions to be settled in local currencies. And that is, that ultimately is a threat to the position of the dollar as the world's reserve currency and to American power, to American wealth. And it's accelerating that. And it's our own doing. It comes from the weaponization of currencies,
right.
The use of, and also just the military posture of the United States, the unilateral bellicosity of our country, which has made many, many other countries wary of participating with us, of putting themselves within our power. When we freeze assets of people who are Vladimir Putin's friends or Russian oligarchs who may or may not have anything to do with what's happening in Russia, people say, well, why are we putting ourselves in a position where we can do that? Why don't we start our own markets? And that's a very dangerous thing for the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, for sure. Do you believe the U.S. government should directly issue a digital currency to citizens?
No, I don't believe that the U.S. government. I'm against central bank digital currencies. I think they will become an instrument of power and control. And ultimately, they'll be used as an excuse to abolish cash currencies, and they give the government complete control over our lives. And I actually, when they, even before the Ottawa event, I gave a speech in Milan warning the people of Italy because they were looking at vaccine passports and central bank digital currencies at that time. And I said, here's what they're doing in China. If you don't meet a certain social credit score, if you did, you show up on a mask day when you're not wearing your mask properly or whatever
Not
your offense is,
or whatever,
or not boosted, the government can turn off your capacity to spend money, or they can program it so that your credit cards will only work, for example, at grocery stores within a half-mile radius of your home.
Right.
But they won't buy you gasoline. They
Right.
won't allow you to get an airplane ticket. They don't allow you to travel and buy, items and foods in other parts of the country or abroad. And if government has those kind of powers over us, we're all in a lot of deep trouble.
Yeah, game over, for sure. Do you have any concerns, though, maybe with kind of like the update of the legacy system with the formation of FedNow and this kind of permission walled garden that already exists in the Federal Reserve System?
I mean, I think FedNow is the first step. It's not a central bank digital currency, but it's the first step.
Agreed.
And, we're all on this slippery slope. And it worries me.
Yeah, same. Can you talk a little bit about the government's actions during COVID? Do you believe it was orchestrated similar to the 2008 crisis to shut down small businesses and regional banks in order to consolidate financial power within the super monopoly?
I don't think it was orchestrated specifically, but, for that purpose, I think those same entities, those powerful entities, will use any crisis as a pretext
Right.
for removing public rights and for clamping down totalitarian controls.
Like 9/11 and Patriot Act or something
Whatever.
like that. Right.
Every crisis throughout history becomes, a pretense for, for certain, for powerful actors in the society to expand their power and to reduce public power and to subvert democracy.
Right. Absolutely. Would you consider canceling debt or recovering ill-gotten gains from the super monopolies that basically stole wealth from the working class?
Well, I would look at litigation against any type of fraud.
Right. Fair. Perfect. Why do you think Trump gets a free pass from the media for the lockdowns and disastrous monetary policy decisions made during his administration? Do you think he gets a free pass?
Yeah, I think the the mainstream media were committed to that agenda.
Right.
And so it's an area that they're not going to criticize him on.
Right. Probably because of conflict of interest of similar investments.
Well,
in
big pharma. There's huge pharmaceutical revenues are one of the primary advertising revenues going into the major media outlets, and those pharmaceutical companies also ultimately dictate content on the stations.
Right. How do you have hope to lead a movement against such, this powerful unified coalition? And what do you say to those that are demoralized and just don't believe that the political system can be used to help citizens anymore?
Well, I would tell them, watch me, watch what I do.
Right.
Because, I still believe that there's a hope for democracy. And, let's give it a chance.
Right.
And if I get in there, I also have absolute confidence that I can fix it.
Beautiful. Do you think that Bitcoin will play a big part of that? Do you think currency addressing the super monopoly kind of head on?
I'm going to make sure that that Bitcoin is protected, that people can keep their own wallets, that the current White House war on Bitcoin will be over, that transactions will be protected and encouraged. And I'll look ultimately at treating it as a currency rather than a commodity.
Right.
Particularly for smaller Bitcoin owners, for transaction owners. I don't want to be. I don't want to provide a windfall for the billionaires who accumulated Bitcoin, but I think smaller actors and transactions, that their transactions should be able to to change currencies the same way that when you go to Canada and you're using the Canadian dollar, you ought to be able to come to the United States without, if there's some appreciation in the Canadian dollar, you shouldn't have to pay for it in taxes.
Capital gains, right? Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Do you see kind of using something akin to like the 230 protections, or even an amendment that would kind of protect such transactions? Or at least that is that
I
on the
don't know
table?
how I would do it, but I don't know. I can tell you the general tenor of my approach and administration. I can't tell you the details about how I'm going to do it. I'm going to, I'm going to consult the smartest people. People in the industry, people like Stanley Druckenmiller and Paul Tudor Jones, and then Bitcoin specialists in order to figure out the best way to do it in ways that will protect our freedoms, in ways that will encourage the reindustrialization of America and the benefits that can accrue to working Americans.
Right. So say right now you're sitting next to, just perchance, the best good faith representation of the Bitcoin community possible, and I'm feeding you exactly what it is that should be done. How do you plan to kind of work with a compromised Congress to get some of these, this regulation in place to protect Bitcoin?
Well, I'm going to do everything that I can without having to go to Congress.
Beautiful.
I'm going to do it through my, control over Treasury policy.
Right.
So, even if it means bringing in the banks and, a lot of the bad policies toward Bitcoin are not being driven by legislation. Mm-hmm. They're being driven by White House policies.
Interesting.
So, I'm going to end the war.
Yeah, beautiful. Speaking of ending the war, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower, warned us about seems to be in full effect with the, provocation of Russia by NATO, increasing military presence in Ukraine. And yet there's some here back home that would say, that this is good for the U.S. economy because we're buying U.S. arms. Would you say the war in Ukraine is actually an economic victory for Biden?
No, I mean, the war is a catastrophe for everybody. We've killed 400,000 Ukrainian kids and probably 70,000 to 100,000 Russians. And, and we're not getting better weapons for it. I know Mitch McConnell said that we shouldn't worry about the $140 billion that we're paying over there because it's all going back to American U.S. arms makers. And, who owns all those arms makers? It's BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard.
Right.
Oh, it's going to the richest people in our country. It's not helping the working poor.
Right.
It's actually, and we're draining a lot of intellectual resources that could be used to reindustrialize our country at home, to build products that are actually valuable, that don't kill people, that make people's lives better, to rebuild our education system.
Right.
$8 trillion that we spent on war, we can make Social Security solvent for 30 years.
Right.
We could pay for every American child's education up through university and give them incredible education. We could pay for child care for every American. We could liquidate all the credit card debt in our country. So many of the problems that we could solve if we kept that money at home, and that's what I'm going to do as president.
Beautiful. Speaking of kind of an analog to that, can you maybe talk about the Weimar Republic and its consequences as sort of a analog or metaphor to what's happening in the U.S. now? Like, could this inflation cause a revolution of sorts? And is there an alternative for the lower, middle, and working class that isn't a violent revolution?
Well, I mean, I'm going to try to solve the problems,
right.
Including beginning with housing. Mm-hmm. Right now you have these big companies, again, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, that are that own so much of America already, and now they're trying to buy all the single-family homes.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
within by 2030, so that's just 6 years from now, 6.5 years, corporations will own 60% of the single-family homes, and my kids can't buy homes. Mm-hmm. So many people, kids, your age, my kids' age, are still living at home with their parents, or they're living in rentals. There's very few of them that are actually purchasing homes. They go out to try to buy a home, and somebody comes in at the last minute with a cash offer, some amorphous LLC with an ambiguous name that you trace it back to BlackRock.
Right.
And it's not a good thing. Thomas Jefferson said American democracy has to be rooted in tens of thousands of independent freeholds owned by individual Americans. And this is a colonial model. It's an aristocracy. It's a feudal aristocracy. If corporations own all the land base in our country, and Americans can't own a home, which means they can't own it. They don't have equity. If you have a home and you want to start a business, you can take a second mortgage and take that risk. But if you don't own equity, you can't get access to capital. And that's where the power is, access to capital. And those companies have access to capital at a much cheaper rate because of their bank books. And they're competing against our children to buy homes.
Right.
And, we built the prosperity in this country after World War II by making sure Americans could get into homes. Mm-hmm. And now that promise of the American dream is now being lost.
Truly. Do you think that it's a coincidence at all that, just moments after the Civil Rights Act passed, that the Nixon shock happened and we get taken off a hard money standard and it becomes...
Well, I think, Nixon in 71, I think, the tipping point of getting taken off the gold standard was the Vietnam War.
Right.
Which was putting us in debt, and they needed to print money.
Right.
And they were frustrated. Kissinger and Nixon were frustrated that they may not be able to get support for the war from the American people, and support for those appropriations from Congress.
Right.
And so they changed the rules. They They abandoned Bretton Woods, and they made it. They divorced America from the gold standard.
Right.
And they started this inflationary cycle that we've been dealing with ever since.
Right. But do you think the timing? I agree for sure about the Vietnam War, but do you think that it's just a coincidence that when they kind of gave full civil rights to kind of minorities in America, that they immediately took, basically your chance to be able to gain wealth away from the American people?
Well, I think, listen, there's definitely a choice made between, for example, the war on poverty and the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And Martin Luther King said we can either go to war against poverty at home, or we can go to war against yellow people in Vietnam.
Right.
And we can't do both.
Right.
None of the money, and so I think those are connections that are clear.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah. No, I appreciate your time so much. Very, very thoughtful answers to all these questions. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you. I'm a Massachusetts boy, and it's an honor to sit here with the Kennedy, and I appreciate it, Bobby. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.